Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morena, welcome everybody and good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the New Zealand Agriculture and Climate Change Conference 2024. Lovely to hear the eager discussion in the room. It's fantastic. Ko Ruth Leary tōku ingoa. My name is Ruth Leary. I work at AgriZeroNZ. I head the strategy and engagement function there, and I'll be kicking off just the start of day 2 as your MC. And all of you here, it's great to see a number of bodies here early in the morning. You're all important stakeholders connected to the kaupapa of what we're talking about here, climate change and agriculture. So please do get yourselves involved in the conversations. I can hear it happening already, but the conversation's also in the app and the Q&A. But please remember, once you're outside this room and these doors in this building, to carry on those conversations as well. That's my urging to you. And as we heard Naomi Parker say yesterday, our day 1 MC, she said we've got to keep our foot to the floor, and she is not wrong. We do need to keep our foot to the floor and take everybody on the journey as well. So we do have a packed agenda today. We've got some quick-fire, rapid presentation rounds later on, so please pay attention and get those questions in and upvote the ones that you want to be listening to as well. So yesterday we covered off the international and domestic operating environments, as well as trade and market drivers, and heard for some fantastic speakers on those topics regarding agriculture emissions reduction. So today we've got another packed agenda. But today we're going to focus more on the progress towards solutions. Really important day today. So we'll be having some quick fire presentations updating us on the science, technology and innovation across the New Zealand and broader ecosystem. We did hear Rod Carr say yesterday, if not planting trees, then what? Today we're going to talk quite a bit about the what. But before we start our opening address today, I do have a couple of reminders on health and safety and logistics points to make. So in the event of an earthquake, we are in Wellington, do remember to drop, take cover and hold wherever you are. Some of you have got tables to get underneath. If there is a fire or other emergency requiring you to vacate the building, please make your way to one of the 2 assembly points outside. So there's adjacent buildings on Cable Street, but also Wakefield Street. And finally, bathrooms on the left, but there's also some across to the right as you head outside the doors at the back of the room. If there is a requirement for first aid assistance today, there is a first aid room located on level 2 and 3 of the building. In the front of house area, there is a defibrillator available in the venues office on the ground floor. I do hope that we get the blood pumping, but not the heart stopping today. And a reminder, if you weren't here yesterday, how to use the app. Make sure you're logged into the app. That will allow you to ask questions, go into the specific session. You'll see the live Q&A there. You can decide to be anonymous or not, your call. And you can upvote those questions, as I mentioned, that you're interested in hearing answered. So what I would like to do now is, without further ado, introduce our opening address, our speaker for this morning, Sir Peter Gluckman. He's going to give our opening address today. So many of you will have heard a lot about Sir Peter, but some of you may not. So just to remind you who we have opening today, Sir Peter is the President of the International Science Council. He is Chair of the Science System Advisory Group. He's previously the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Has many other accolades to his name as well, but ultimately Sir Peter is championing evidence-based solutions to global challenges and really digging into capability of some of the new and emerging technologies we have on offer today. So welcome, Sir Peter, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and I apologise that I couldn't be with you. I originally intended to be, but I've got a few other tasks on which I have to get done in Auckland today. I'm not going to say anything very profound, but I think we all know that New Zealand's economy has been built on the backbone of agricultural research. Scobie's often quoted 1986 calculation, I think, is still valid, showing that returns of investment for agricultural research annualise at more than 17%, which highlights how much pastoral research has contributed to the growth of New Zealand's productivity. But when one looks at the range of research that's been conducted in CRIs in universities and in the private sector, much of this has required slow and cumulative effects. Examples over the last 20, 30 years include the genetic selection of livestock for beneficial traits, the discovery and selection of endophytes to promote the growth and protection of ryegrass, or the discovery that the South American parasitoid wasp can suppress the destructive grassland peast, the Argentine stem weevil. All this work is worth many hundreds of millions of dollars a year. The dairy industry has been the cornerstone of much of our economy, particularly since the GFC, but by and large our economy remains largely based on commodity-based export trade with some rather simple value-added products. There are some exceptions. We also need to reflect on the lessons from A2 milk and whether in the future genetic approaches could produce foods or milk extracts with proven health claims. Within this environment, we've seen how the pastoral sector has protected the economy during the emergence of a more entrepreneurial sector of our society and economy, with the tech and innovation sector growing in strength. The time is now, how do we bring these two sectors together? The challenges that our pastoral economy faces are now clear. Given its contribution to the economy and its essential role in protecting our rural and provincial societies, we need to adjust rapidly to the need to reduce methane production. The other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and CO2, are more important, but we cannot ignore the disproportionate forcing effects of methane. The IPCC has pointed out to a compelling logic to giving priority to methane production, and while there are many other sources of methane, both natural, such as in tundra melting, and anthropogenic, such as in fracking and in paddy rice, New Zealand must confront the burden of agricultural methane, both for existential as well as for financial reasons. The cost of buying offshore credits to meet our NDCs certainly creates risk to our near-term future. I'm no expert on ruminant physiology, so there's nothing I can say that's particularly profound given who's in the room. But I have engaged peripherally on the question of agricultural greenhouse gases since 2008, when John Key, as leader of the opposition, talked to me about the need to establish an agricultural greenhouse gas research centre. And in 2010, I chaired the scientific component of the inaugural meeting in Wellington to establish the Global Research Alliance, and I chaired its collaborative grant funding mechanisms in its early years. But my focus today will be on where we go from here. Internationally, quite a lot of progress has been made in meeting the challenge of methane production. But much of this progress is limited in its direct application to New Zealand, in that our industry is based on pastoral grazing systems, not on feedlots. Therefore, inhibitors such as 3-NOP, while starting to have real impact on methane production in Europe, Latin America and Asia as a feed additive, is not so here. Part of this is obviously because of the mode of application, but there's been other limitations in our system that have been inhibitory. By way of example, our regulatory processes had for many years inhibited the company that developed 3-NOP from working on long-term acting forms for use in New Zealand. This highlights the country's rather poor strategic approach that, for a variety of reasons, has led to disparate decision-making. I could say much more about this, as I initially linked New Zealand's chemists to the company that developed 3-NOP to create an application for our system, but I do not want to focus on the story, but rather to make the point that vital moonshot-type research requires a much more strategic approach towards regulation. The decisions of regulatory agencies are critical to innovation and as critical as the adoption of the science to its adoption as is the science itself. Contrast this with how quickly the system responded to Peter Beck, in building a major aerospace industry. I was in Europe last week. There I saw approaches that might get around the challenges that restrict the pastoral use of inhibitors. For example, could one manipulate the appetite preferences of calves so that they grow up with a preference to inhibitor-containing pellets placed in the paddock? There are, of course, issues beyond the scope of this talk around toxicity and so forth, but again, I want to simply suggest the need to be innovative and thinking through how we can take the knowledge from feedlot systems and apply it domestically. I was given the title for this address pointing to the role of new and advanced technologies in dealing with enteric greenhouse gas eructation. However, I cannot attempt in a few minutes to consider all such possibilities, or indeed all the ways that greenhouse gas reduction might be addressed. But in preparing for this talk, I decided to review recent papers on ruminant methane production, and what's become abundantly clear to me is how much the complexity of the understanding of the rumen and its physiology has grown in the last decade. Methane production is not simply a matter of fermentation in the rumen producing hydrogen that feed a methogenic bacterium that captures the hydrogen and releases it as methane as a product of the way that those bacteria produce energy for their own survival and reproduction. The system involves multiple classes of bacteria, as well as the very difficult to work on other microorganisms, the archaea. Other bacteria in the rumen can also use hydrogen to produce acetate and propionate and do not produce methane. Can they be used as competitors against the methanogens? Then add to the complexity there are fungi and especially ciliate protozoa in the rumen that also affect the ecosystem. And in turn, the ecosystem of the rumen is affected by many other factors, including the genetics and physiological state of the host animal, obviously by the forages it eats, and by its developmental history, how its microbiota developed in the first place. Such complexity has a number of implications. The first is, why does this complexity exist? Ruminants rely absolutely on fermentation of non-digestible carbohydrates to produce the short fatty acids that are their dominant energy supply. This is the ruminant equivalent of our glucose, and so evolution has ensured redundancy in the system, and thus there's been no selection pressure against methane eructation. Secondly, evolution has equally created complex equilibria in the rumen with the coexistence of many species and types of microorganisms, as well as the genetics of the host ruminant. We're only beginning to understand how the microbial complex system communities work, and then most of that understanding has been largely in humans with much simpler aerobic systems. Thus, it's inevitable that perturbation of the system is more likely to have transient than persistent effects, and that equilibria via various pathways will be restored. Hence, single perturbations will, as many thousands of papers in the scientific literature show, have unequal and inconsistent effects, and designing what might be an effective intervention farming system is very complex. Here, inhibitors, if they are safe, may be the only real silver bullets if we know how to use them. Further, at the end of the day, no intervention is worthwhile if it's not affordable, scalable, and most importantly, enhances rather than inhibits productivity. Indeed, at the end of the day, as we've seen already in the sheep industry, enhancing productivity per animal may be the best way to get stock numbers down and therefore reduce greenhouse gas loads. But back to the complexity of the rumen and dealing with its microbiotically driven physiology. There are a raft of claims and agents and forages, both raw or pre-treated, that might affect methane production. This list is long, including saponins, pre-treated forages, new forages, tannins, lipids, oils, bromoforms, alga extracts, all associated with various claims of their actions in the complex ecosystem of the rumen. Reading such claims is rather confusing. Then there are the direct inhibitors, such as 3-NOP, which we've discussed, and that directly inhibit the enzyme in the final step of methane production by the anaerobes, in particular methyl coenzyme M reductase. Alternatively, there's a focus on manipulating the rumen microflora by vaccination of the animal to reduce certain strains by probiotics, or potentially could we inoculate with desirable strains? There are difficult to study bacteria and archaea, such as Cornella, that appear to compete for hydrogen and yet do not produce methane. Last week in Europe, I saw claims of forage manipulation that markedly reduced methane production, enhanced productivity, but was directly related to promoting a greater abundance of Cornella, an alternate approach to vaccination. One important fact we know that if we're to manipulate the rumen microbiome by either vaccination or by inoculation, it's more likely to have lasting effects if it's done early in the host's life. And then on top of all this, we have variation in the host animal. There's been compelling evidence of animal selection for lower levels of methane production, but the genetic or epigenetic basis of this is unclear. Is it in the genetics of the host itself, or the community in its rumen, or both? To date, the polygenetic and perhaps multi-species nature of such a response remains unclear. But in all of this complexity, one tool stands out. That's the potential of artificial intelligence to make a sense of a very complex system of systems. It's the type of data that traditional systems analyses are likely to be totally confounded by. AI is much more than ChatGPT, and there are multiple forms of AI that can be used to both synthesize the enormous amount of available evidence from all sorts of sources and to construct complex multidimensional models to define what might be the most effective targets for serious efforts and focused intervention. 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting in London on the use of AI in science, and the methane-free cow was highlighted as a place to go. It's likely that multiple interventions will be needed, just as in humans dealing with many diseases, and that multiple elements will need to be addressed in parallel. I worry that we persist with thinking only in terms of a silver bullet approach when evolution tells us it may need to be a multi-pronged attack. New Zealand is woefully behind in developing and using AI, and here is a singular application that merits real focus. And AI has other potentials. The Google company DeepMind's inventor Denis Hassabis this year received the Nobel Prize for using AI to predict the shape of proteins. And in their public database, AlphaFold, there's information on 800,000 different proteins and their three-dimensional probabilistic structure. Why is this important? Enzymes are, of course, proteins. And if we know the shape of a protein, then AI can design molecules that will bind enzymes in ways that will block its actions. Could we therefore use AI to design inhibitors of the key enzymes in the pathways? Similarly, could we use AI-based analytical approaches to explore potential toxicity of such inhibitors? This is now the primary form of drug design in human medicine, and we should be thinking about using it in methane inhibition. Can we find a non-toxic molecule that can be used in a pasture system, either directly or including in grasses, say through endophyte delivery, to meet our needs? A third use of AI will be to do what I do not think has yet been done, to make a multi-species polygenetic analysis of what we are selecting for between host and ruminant inhabitants when we select for high or low methane producers. And all this leads on to the other two technologies we need to get rapidly back on track with: synthetic biology and genetic engineering. I will not say much about synthetic biology, except to say it's moving at pace. Essentially, it's the combination of information technologies such as AI with molecular and cell biology to produce viruses or bacteria that have design properties. It may sound futuristic, But if AI holds its promise, could we design a bacterium that has the properties of Quinella, but is readily culturable and able to be inoculated into the calf? More immediately, we have genetic possibilities. CRISPR is the most exact of the bioengineering techniques and holds so much promise for agriculture. While there's been some early and rather crude efforts with transgenesis to increase metabolizable energy in ryegrasses, CRISPR offers so many more opportunities alongside traditional genetic techniques. Can we change the soil microbiota? Can we use endophytes and inhibitor delivery mechanisms? Further to this, can we manipulate the rumen biota to preferentially produce propionate or release inhibitors? Once we know what we're selecting for in low methane producing animals, can we use genetic analyses to accelerate the processes of selection? Notably, CRISPR is now being used increasingly widely in human medicine, and mRNA vaccines such as that used in COVID are now widely in use. We've been inhibited for 2 decades by attitudes to modern molecular biology. But attitudes and indeed the regulatory field are changing. We can no longer pretend to meet the needs of sustaining an agricultural sector in its current form and meeting its needs to reduce methane production without exploring these technologies. There are, of course, many issues, human, animal and environmental safety being at the top of the list. We face these issues with any chemical put into the food chain, and we have well-developed mechanisms to deal with such. The global experience with GM and GE has not revealed any of the effects that early objectors had claimed, and we continue to manipulate genes of plants all the time. I was at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna last week discussing the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies, and they're extensively using radiation-induced random mutagenesis followed by selection still as the basis of plant development, especially in the developing world. A much cruder and less precise methodology of random mutagenesis than what we can do with CRISPR, and yet it's used as a routine around the world. Social license is key in the food industry, and this not only relates to the use of the technologies, but also to the market responses. Thus, many countries are now recognising that they must enhance science literacy and science education as AI and life sciences technologies become critical to our futures. The sad state of science education in New Zealand is an absolute indictment on our education system. Solving complex problems requires systems approaches, and the existential and escalating problem impacts of global warming cannot be shrugged off as somebody else's problem. The first world has created the problem, and as part of the first world, we must make our contribution to addressing it. Trade-offs are needed, and the nature of those trade-offs affect many interests. Hence, it's been so difficult to confront politically. Technologies will not solve all the issues, but for New Zealand to avoid addressing the methane challenge properly will simply create other fiscal challenges if we're to meet our NDCs. In the interest of time, I've not talked about the other greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but the same technologies have value in reducing nitrous oxide emissions, and much work is already going on in farm systems to reduce CO2 emissions. In Europe and the USA, we're now seeing major claims of massive reductions in methane production over the next decade. But these are referring to largely feedlot-based systems. However, if they are true to these claims, we can no longer claim to be the most greenhouse gas efficient milk producers in the world. New Zealand must greatly accelerate its research capacities in advanced technologies, with the methane question being one obvious reason why. At the same time, we need to greatly expand our international science collaborations as we're at risk of being left behind. We're woefully unprepared for an AI-based world. Right now, we face the imminent prospect of non-tariff barriers being levelled against our pastoral products based on the levels of methane production by our livestock. Science and science-based innovation are far more central to our future as a nation than has been recognised by governments over the last 25 years. But I think that AI, life science technologies, and good systems analyses and good farm practices can shift things a long way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sir Peter, for that very insightful presentation to kick off our day. We've probably got time for one, perhaps two questions. There is a lot in the app. There's a lot of interest in your conversation. I'll start with the one with the most votes, and it's a question relating to when we will expect to hear the outcomes of the science system review work that's happening at the moment.
I can't answer that question. It's not in my hands.
Okay, I'll move on to the second one. When will New Zealand know the ultimate GMO position for New Zealand, i.e. what's in and what's out?
Well, there's regulations, as I understand it, going through the House, go through the process, and a regulator being established next year. Clearly, that regulators, the government is learning a lot of lessons from the Australian regulator. The detail, I think, will come through those processes. I don't have any particular deep expertise. I've not been involved in the direct discussions on that, so I can't answer it specifically. But it relates first to getting the legislation in place, then the regulator established, and the regulator will have to work through. But my understanding is they're going to largely take lessons from the Australian experience.
Yes, thank you, and that's my understanding too. And we are right on time at 9 o'clock, so thanks again, Sir Peter. It's really, you've given us some food for thought as we head into the next session on progressing towards solutions. You raised where to from here. You talked about strategic approaches to regulation and the need for affordable, scalable, and increasing productivity solutions. And you also reminded us that AI is definitely more than just ChatGPT. So thank you so much for that. Thank you very much. I will now introduce and hand over to David Hughes, who is Board Chair of the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. Always a mouthful to say that. Can I please ask David, Harry Clark and Richard Eckard to come to the stage, please? Thank you.